Welcome to video 3, where we're going to be talking about the earliest purported hominins, emphasis on purported, so not all paleoanthropologists agree that these are actually hominins. And we'll be talking about two species in this video, Sahelanthropus chadensis and Orrorin tugenensis. So these are the genus and species names. Okay, so just as a reminder, you've seen this slide before, but what is a hominin? Well, the precise and accurate definition is all species on the human side after chimpanzees and bonobos split from humans 7 to 5 million years ago. So these include all species that lead directly to humans, right? An analogy would be our grandparents. So without our grandparents, we would not be here today. So those species that are directly on the line and those that are side branches. So these would be the siblings of our grandparents. And if they didn't exist, we could still exist. So these are all hominins. Okay. And so the earliest hominins are dated to about this time period, between 4 and 7 million years ago. So one of the trickiest things about actually just identifying the earliest hominin and establishing whether it is a hominin or not is that a species that will have branched off the last common ancestor on the human side and thus is a hominin will actually probably look very similar to a species that branched off on the chimpanzee and bonobo side, which is not a hominin. And that's because they're both quite close in time to the last common ancestor, so they haven't had much time to evolve and diverge and look very different. And again, this is the biggest problem with identifying who the earliest hominin is. It's because these two species are hypothesized to look very similar. So how do we actually tell whether we have the earliest hominin instead of something like the earliest chimpanzee or bonobo, right? How do we tell them apart? So just as a reminder, the two main characteristics, the shared derived traits that we use to define a hominin are adaptations for habitual bipedalism and small non-honing canines with apical wear. So hominins, a really quick note on their names in terms of their roots. And so anthro, you'll see that often, that is Greek for human, right? Again, anthropology, the study of humans. And pith or pitha is Greek for ape. Okay, and sometimes these species are named after the place where they're found, and you'll see that that's the case for Sahelanthropus chadensis and Orrorin tugenensis. And again, this is just a map of Africa showing all the sites where hominins are found. Again, mostly in Eastern Africa and South Africa. So this is a nice pretty picture of all the ancient hominin species. Since this picture was made, we now have added more to the hominin family tree. And again, as always, time oldest at the bottom, youngest at the top. And you can see all of the species, most of which we'll cover in this class. And for this video and this lecture, we're covering the earliest purported hominins. So these are those are these ones. And it is worth noting here that everyone is always searching for the first. So in the context of this lecture, everyone wants to discover the first hominin, the earliest hominin, right? With it comes fame and I guess fortune. But it has become such a rat race with such interesting personalities and intrigue that a book was written about it. So I highly recommend this one. It's called The First Human by Anne Gibbons. And again, it's very, very difficult to actually definitively demonstrate that what you think you have is the first actual earliest hominin, right? Because they're going to have this mix of ape-like traits and human traits, as one would expect for species that just diverge from the last common ancestor between chimpanzees and humans. Okay, so the candidates for the earliest hominin, we'll be talking about three. So we have these three doors. So who is behind door number one? The first species that we'll talk about, that's Sahelanthropus chadensis. So here you go, Sahelanthropus chadensis, discovered in the country of Chad, hence the name chadensis. So often when you see the suffix ensis, it usually means from. So chadensis means from Chad, dated to 7 to 6 million years ago. And Sahelanthropus, that name comes from, it's because Sahel is a region south of the Sahara, which is where Sahelanthropus was found. And again, anthropos means human, right? And again, ensis means from. So this is the human of the Sahel, the region south of the Sahara, from the country of Chad. And Sahelanthropus chadensis is affectionately called Tumai, that's its nickname, which means hope of life. So if you remember that Mike Pence video I showed earlier in the semester, he actually talked about this new discovery, which he called the Torbay skull. He was actually talking about this. It's pronounced Tumai. And it was discovered by this French paleontologist, paleoanthropologist, Michel Brunet. So Sahelanthropus chadensis, again, is dated as 7 to 6 million years ago using biostratigraphy. Here we have that map of Africa again, right? And here it is, one of the few hominin fossils, at least the earlier ones, that are found outside of Eastern Africa and South Africa in the country of Chad at a site called Toros Manala. This is the main specimen from Sahelanthropus chadensis. It is a cranium. You can see that it's distorted, right? It almost looks like it's raising its right eyebrow, but that's just because of all of that sediment on top, very heavy, compacting and distorting the specimen. If you reconstruct it using fancy computer methods, this is what it looks like. So this is the frontal view. We're looking at its face, side view, the top view, and the bottom view. And there are actually postcrania that have been found with the Sahelanthropus cranium. So here's the cranium, and you see all of these other bones, one of which is a femur, which from the previous lecture you know is actually very diagnostic of bipedalism, but for some reason it's unpublished, and detractors will assume that that's because the femur shows that it's not bipedal and thus not a hominin. We cannot know that for sure because, again, the postcrania are unpublished. So why is Sahelanthropus chadensis a hominin? So I'm going to use this little icon to denote features that indicate that it is a hominin, right? So these shared derived characteristics. So a happy thumbs up means pro-hominin traits. So here we're looking at the bottom view of a gorilla, Sahelanthropus, and these other hominins. And you can see here, well, you can see what I'm getting at. The foramen magnum is anteriorly placed on Sahelanthropus, right? If you remember, for chimpanzees and other great apes, it's more posteriorly placed towards the back of the cranium for hominins, and indicative of the cranium balancing on top of the spinal column, the foramen magnum is more anteriorly placed more towards the front of the cranium. Sahelanthropus chadensis also has a smaller non-honing canine with apical wear, so that very important second shared-derived trait that defines hominins. You can see that the canine is still actually pretty large, as you would expect for an early hominin, right? Something that would look more ape-like, maybe something like a chimp. Still large, but relatively speaking, it is smaller than, say, the canine of a chimp, and it is non-honing and has apical wear. Sahelanthropus also has a pretty orthognathic face, so a very flat face, not very prognathic like you would see in a chimpanzee. So that orthognathic face is, again, a derived human-like trait. So what makes Sahelanthropus primitive? What traits does it have that's more ape-like and not human-like? And so for these primitive ape-like traits, which kind of detract from it being a hominin, I'm going to use this sad, kind of confused, miserable face emoji. Okay, so it has a very large brow ridge, as you can see here. right? That's not very human-like at all. It's something you associate more with, again, chimpanzees, gorillas, and other great apes. It has a very small brain size, 350 cubic centimeters. So that's well in the range of a chimpanzee, whereas humans have something that's like around 1400. And if we're looking at the underside of the cranium, we can see that the dental arcade is U-shaped and has these parallel cheek teeth rows. So there you go. And it is these primitive traits that have some paleoanthropologists asking, is it Sahelanthropus and thus a hominin, that anthro, or is it actually Sahelanthropus with the pitha, which means ape? So these authors actually do not think Sahelanthropus is a hominin. So again, purported hominin. Now, Sahelanthropus chinensis, we know lived in a forest by a lake. How do we know that? Right, well, here's the artist's reconstruction. You can see Sahelanthropus looking very regal. There's the lake. And I guess forest is pretty generous for how this artist reconstructed the environment. But you can see there's presence of trees. And so we know Sahelanthropus lived in a forest near a lake because it has been found with fish, right, indicative of a body of water. Crocodiles, same. Hippos, indicative of body of water. Giraffes, right, long neck, feet on leaves, indicative of trees. And colobine monkeys, which are also, if you remember from our primate lectures, indicative of trees. They have all those wonderful adaptations for eating leaves. And so why is it important to know that Sahelanthropus lived in a forest near a lake? Well, there are two reasons here. So one, if you remember the savanna hypothesis for the origins of bipedalism, that the selective pressures involved with transitioning from arboreal lifestyle to a more on-the-ground terrestrial lifestyle, that's what created the impetus for bipedalism. Well, in this case, Sahelanthropus falsifies that if it is indeed a hominin. And two, the second reason is because it's all about, if we want to understand evolution, why do species look the way they do? It's all about understanding natural selection, the selective pressures, and one of the great selective pressures acting on organisms is the environment, right? As exemplified in an example I just went over with the savanna hypothesis. Okay, so that was door number one. That was Sahelanthropus chadensis. Who's behind door number two? Well, that's going to be Orrorin tugenensis. So Orrorin tugenensis was found in Kenya in Eastern Africa, dated to 6 million years ago. And Orrorin, the genus name, means original man in the local Tugen language. And it was discovered by these two French paleoanthropologists, Martin Pickford and Brigitte Senu. So here's a map of Africa again. We see Orrorin tugenensis found in Kenya in Eastern Africa at a site called the Tugen Hills. So you can probably guess why it has its species name. Again, ensis means from, so this is from Tugen, the name of the site, Tugen Hills. And here it is in Kenya. You can see where it's located in the country. You can see where the country is located in the African continent. Okay, again, found Tugen Hills. You can see what the site looks like. It is indeed very hilly and very pretty. It's been dated as 6 million years ago based on potassium argon dating. So again, potassium argon dating needs ashes. So it never dates the fossils themselves. It dates the layers above and below them. And again, Eastern Africa is very volcanically active. So there's always volcanoes constantly spewing ash. So there's always these ashes that are available for dating. And this is always very common in Eastern Africa. So if you have a hominin that you know is in Eastern Africa and you don't remember how it was dated, a good guess is always potassium argon dating. So why is Orrorin tugenensis a hominin? Well, we have the femur here, right, the thigh bone, which again is a very diagnostic bone for determining whether the individual is bipedal or not. So if we compare a modern human femur, the chimpanzee, here's Orrorin, and you can see that Orrorin and the modern human share many traits that are indicative of bipedal locomotion. So one is a large femoral head. I didn't go over this in my bipedalism lecture, but you can imagine when we stood on two legs, there is way more body weight on our hind limbs. And so having these large joint surfaces, so this actually fits right in the hip socket, helps dissipate that weight. A long femoral neck, that's another feature I didn't go over, but that helps make the gluteus minimus and gluteus medius more efficient. Remember, those are the hip stabilizer muscles. And the presence of an obturator externus groove on the backside of the neck. So what is that? Well, the obturator externus groove is a muscle that's important for bipedal locomotion for reasons I won't get into. But whenever the muscle pulls on the femur, it actually rubs up against the back of the neck of the femur and leaves this groove. And you see that in modern humans and you see it in Orrorin, but you do not see it in chimpanzees. Okay, so why is Orrorin tugenensis a hominin? We also have a large upper canine, but it has apical wear. So very similar to Sahelanthropus, where the canine is larger than, say, ours, still smaller than in chimpanzees, but there is no honing. It's apical wear only. And what makes Orrorin tugenensis primitive? Well, the upper arm bone, the humerus, we have that. And so here is Orrorin's humerus. This is a chimpanzee's. This is a human. The Orrorin humerus is similar to a chimp's, indicating climbing abilities. So specifically, it has these large flaring crests, very similar to chimpanzee, not like a human, which is thinner and more gracile. And these flaring crests are indicative of muscles that are used for climbing. So that is a more primitive trait that Orrorin has, not indicative of bipedalism, and so is one that detractors will focus on and say that Orrorin isn't a hominin. So what kind of environment did Orrorin tugenensis live in? It lived in a forest, again, based on animal fossils that were found with it, so just like Sahelanthropus. And I won't go into what the animals are, but the environment would basically look something like this. Okay, so that finishes our third video. Our fourth video, we will go over the other two purported hominin species, Ardipithecus cadaba and Ardipithecus ramidus.